Thank you, Ray. And thank you to the SBIA, or the Small Business Industry Assistance. So I'll probably do that a lot today, where I'll say an acronym and then I'll try to read it out. If I don't do that and I use an acronym and you don't know what it is or don't say what it is, just raise your hand. That way I can pause and stop myself. All right, so this works great. So what we're going to do today is introduce the IND process and clinical trial regulation a little bit, because the IND process and the IND itself, and I'll tell you what the IND is in a minute, really fits in to where clinical trial regulation has come about in this country. I'll also discuss how to determine if an IND is needed, so that you can walk away from this meeting, hopefully, and this conference, hopefully, knowing, okay, I need to do an IND, and what are the next steps. And then we'll summarize the types of INDs and share some information on the PreIND consultation. And that'll lead really nicely into the next presentation on different communication pathways with the FDA. So before we dive in, do a quick poll question in the audience here about the extent of your knowledge regarding an IND. So does everyone know what an IND is? I see a lot of nodding. And you've heard of an IND. What about, have you ever submitted an IND? Just a show of hands. Excellent. So it's about half of the room. Who have submitted an IND and they know why they did? They weren't just doing it because they were told to do it. Okay, so some of the hands went down. Hopefully after this meeting, you'll understand why you had to submit that IND. I don't know, Jeff, if you were able to gather anything from online. We'll leave it up for just a second. This helps. Stories I'll tell maybe I'll tailor them based on this. All right, so as that's gathering information, I'll start with the story that maybe hits on that last piece. Why do I need an IND? So when I was in the Division of Gastroenterology and Embryonic Products, we were working with some folks in the Division of Non-Prescription Drug Products, because they had received an IND from, I think it was a graduate student doing research in the diet area. They wanted to do a taste study on various different antacids. So what they wanted to do was essentially take individuals and have them run through about 15 or 20, we weren't exactly sure how many different available antacids on the market. So if you don't know, there's about 120 different over-the-counter antacid products available in the US, and probably more globally. And within those, they all probably share about, a handful of active ingredients. So if you imagine someone's going to be taking one antacid and then wait a couple of minutes, and we weren't sure how much time they would wait, try another antacid. By the time you get through 20, they might take 20 times of the available active ingredient they should be taking. So the researcher said, well, I called to do an IND because my IRB at my institution where I do research told me I had to submit an IND. We weren't quite sure either if we needed an IND, because it's just some antacids, it's over-the-counter products. But the more and more we learned about the study that this individual was going to do, the more we got really, really concerned about what if one particular person, over the course of like 5 minutes, just chewed 20 different antacids and got that much sodium bicarbonate in their stomach. Yeah, maybe they probably would have just thrown up or got nauseous, but it could have been really serious. So that's an example of why you need an IND. And I'll explain more about that as we get into some of the regulations a bit later. So it's about the same as the room, so a good 50% knew what an IND was, and a slightly smaller percent knew what an IND was but didn't know quite why they had to submit one. So after this presentation, you'll have a much better understanding. All right, clicker's working. So IND stands for Investigational New Drug Application. The terminology here, or the lexicon, was actually sort of parallel to the New Drug Application, which we already had in existence at the time when the regulations for the IND came about. What this actually is, the IND, is an exemption from the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act for having that new drug marketing application. So this was your way to actually take a product that doesn't have a marketing approval in the United States and do research on it, transport it across interstate lines. You get that exemption from that very basic requirement of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. It's a means to also obtain FDA permission. So other than just saying, oh, I've got an IND, I can move this across the interstate commerce lines, you actually do need FDA's permission to do that. And again, I'll get into the regulations and why we have that requirement. All of the information about how to implement the IND regulations or the requirements of the IND are in 21 CFR 312. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. So if everyone, I don't have to maybe get into how a bill becomes a law, and then a law becomes regulations, and then guidances, and then policy and actions. But essentially, the CFR is how a federal agency interprets the legislative requirements, the statutes, and how we expect you to implement those requirements, and how we expect to follow those requirements as well. So now a bit of a history lesson, and I get really excited about this stuff because fascinating history. I mean, most of the drug law in this country and probably in the world is all based on terrible things that have happened. And so it's really important to understand the basis of why we have some of these laws. So the FDA really got its teeth in 1906 as a result of the problems that were identified in the meatpacking industry. You've all probably heard of the book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So there were just all sorts of terrible things. People were hand welding cans of meat, and all sorts of things were in those cans of meat. They didn't always weld them very well, so all kinds of stuff would get in there. And while, yeah, of course, if you're a consumer and you open up a can and it smells terrible, you throw it out. But sometimes botulism, you can't smell that. And that was actually found in some of those cans because of the abhorrent meatpacking practices. So that created a lot of impetus in public for the enactment of some sort of regulations or requirements to protect the food supply in this country. And there was also some issues going on at the time regarding drugs and biologics. There was the production of the diphtheria vaccine at the time being made in horses, and there was one particular horse that happened to have tetanus. And so as they were making that vaccine for diphtheria, one of those lines of vaccine had a lot of tetanus in it. And this wasn't really found out until it had already gotten to a bunch of children, and a lot of children died as a result of this. So a lot of these things converged, and that's sort of what spurred the Food and Drugs Act in 1906. At the time, really all this gave us, the FDA, was the ability to say you can't misbrand your products and you can't have them adulterated. It didn't give us any requirements that those products actually be safe or proven to be effective. And that's where we sort of move into 1938. So the 1938 Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act is where we actually could require that drugs be shown to be safe before marketing would start. And this was a totally new system of drug regulation. And for those who are interested in the history, this came about as a result of the sulfamilamide disaster. So a lot of sulfa drugs were being made in the 20s and the 30s, sort of following on to the big break with penicillin. And there was a company, I forget the name, I think it was a US company, that wanted to make a solution of the sulfamilamide. So it was currently a tablet form or a capsule form. And according to the laws at the time, in order to be an elixir, you had to use alcohol in the elixir. That was the only regulation we had on elixirs. But this company was using polyethylene glycol, which is basically antifreeze, to then dissolve the sulfamilamide and make an elixir out of it. So I think it was about 100 or so patients became extremely ill from digesting antifreeze. Some of them died, and many of them were children. And as a result of that disaster, that's where it was then decided that, look, FDA or some regulatory body needs to have eyes on these drugs before they hit the market to make sure that they are going to be safe. But that doesn't really give us efficacy. That only makes sure that we have safe drugs on the market. But do those drugs have to work? So going on all this time was all those cure-all, wonder-all elixirs, right? A lot of them had all sorts of things that just make you feel good, maybe cocaine or something in them. For the most part, they could still be on the market. Remember, we only had that one requirement that said an elixir had to have like 50% or something alcohol to make sure that it was an elixir. So we didn't have any way to say that these actually had to work. But that's not what created the impetus behind the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments. What actually created that incident was thalidomide. Everyone's probably heard this story. They've heard the great heroism of Francie Kelsey. Essentially, this was a sleeping pill. It was really a sedative. And it was just so safe. Like you couldn't give, you could give as much thalidomide to rats as you could possibly imagine and they would not die. Like nothing bad would happen to these rats, except for birth defects. But that wasn't actually getting out into the public. So in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, thalidomide was the next big thing. It was being sold as much as aspirin. And everyone loved it for sleeping, for pregnant women who have morning sickness, for you name it. And when the company came to the US and wanted to market it in the US, the typical process was you prove that it was safe and then you could market it. So there were samples being distributed out into the US market system. Some doctors were starting to test it, and that was okay prior to 1962. But when it got to the FDA, and Francie Kelsey was reviewing this, she said, oh, wait, look. There's no studies of this being done in animals that shows its reprotoxicity. And we need to see this. And so she held the line as the very strong bureaucrat that she was and held off so long that it finally became public about the birth defects that were occurring with thalidomide in Europe and also some of the examples as well in the US. That created this huge impetus for the 1962 Kefauver-Harris drug amendments. And this essentially ensured that drugs not only were safe, but also that they had to be efficacious. So it proposed that sponsors had to submit reports of preclinical tests before clinical testing. I mentioned there were samples being distributed in the US while this drug was being reviewed for its marketing application. And so that's sort of where this small piece came about, where we had to actually have some tests to prove that it was safe in humans before we could even do testing in humans. This law led to the 1963 IND regulations, which basically have everything that I'm going to then get into with the rest of this presentation. All right. Clicker stalling. Or maybe slides stalling. So maybe while that's coming up, I'll talk a little bit more about history. So sort of the next big piece of legislation that came about between the 60s, and I'll talk a bit about it today in today's presentation on expanded access, or the subset about expanded access types of INDs, was in the 80s, sort of the need for compassionate use for drugs. And that was a big piece around the AIDS epidemic or the HIV epidemic and the availability of drugs to patients in urgent situations where they had exhausted all of their options. So the IND regulations changed quite a bit from 1963 and into the 80s, where we actually had multiple rules being proposed about how you could call into the FDA and get access to a product that was investigationally being studied versus products that were actually available on the market. All right. All right. Jeff loads that up. So that's the fun part. Now we're going to get into the dry stuff. All right, a delayed laugh. Yeah. So now we're going to talk about, okay, do I need an IND? Keep going. We're on like slide. Or you can. I'll flip up. We're on like 10. No, it's fine. All right, so when is an IND needed? There's essentially 3 questions you have to ask yourself. Now, they're FDA questions, so they're really, really complicated, right? But essentially, you can boil it down to 3. So the first one is it a drug? So, right, really, really easy question. Is it being used in a clinical investigation? I think that's an easier question. And then does it meet the IND exemption criteria? Even easier question, because we're pretty clear about that in the regulations. So let's spend some time on the first one. So for the definition of a drug, we have to go to 21 U.S.C., so that's United States Code. That's where the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act lives. 321 G 1B C, so that's just tells you where it's in there somewhere. It's like the card catalog in the library, right? So, and by the way, the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act is the first time we actually defined what a drug was. So prior to that point, drugs were just anything. We didn't really have anything to cover that. So the statute defines a drug as articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and articles other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. So those items in quotations there are really important when you're trying to understand, do I have a drug? In general, it's important to note that a drug is defined by its intended use and not the nature of the substance. So a great example of that is the dietary supplement that wants to be a drug, right? So the perfect example I remember from my days in the review division was cranberry. So cranberry concentrate. You can buy this anywhere. It's sold in the grocery store, not even as a dietary supplement. I think some companies like AZO sell it as a treatment for urinary tract infections or female health. But when you come in and you say, I actually want to use or study cranberry concentrate for its ability to either prevent, cure a urinary tract infection or treat a urinary tract infection, that's when it becomes a drug. Even though it's just cranberry that's been concentrated and provided in a pill form or a tablet form, it's a drug because of its intended use. Now, is it being used in the clinical investigation? This is where you would go to the CFR, or the Code of Federal Regulations, 312.3. So here the regulations define a clinical investigation as any experiment in which drug is administered or dispensed to or used involving one or more human subjects. So what's an experiment? So the purpose of this part is an experiment is any use of a drug except for the use of a marketed drug in the course of medical practice. So think about what is in the current labeling for a product, what's currently the state of the art in a medical practice for the use of a product, and that might help you understand the definition of where you are for an experiment. Typically, these are conducted by pharmaceutical companies. There's probably a lot of pharmaceutical companies here, or their representatives are here in this room. But also, we have researchers that frequently are doing research on products, and their intent is not to actually market a drug or to change the marketing labeling for a drug. And that's can be a little bit of a gray area, but still, depending on certain situations, you would regulate that as a clinical investigation. So does it meet the IND exemption criteria? So this is a very important piece. And you have to work through essentially two questions. And then there's some very descriptive parts that I'll cover on the next couple of slides. So if you're using an approved drug, but you're using it for an unapproved use, it does not necessarily mean you have to have an IND. It's not necessarily a clinical investigation yet at this point. So you'd ask yourself, is the product lawfully marketed in the U.S. as a drug under one of these following circumstances? So it has marketing approval, and we're simply studying this drug, or we're using it as is authorized in the marketing approval, or it has over-the-counter monographs that are associated with it. So I don't know if there's anyone here familiar with over-the-counter drugs, but essentially they have a monograph that tells you not only how you make the drug, but also how you can use the drug in the market, how you can sell the product, including all the way down to the way the labels have to be on the outside of the boxes that you put on the store shelves. So if you're studying the product, it's an approved product, and you're studying it for a use that's already approved, so the indication is already approved and in the labeling, you're probably going to be exempt. Now, if your answer is no to either one of those, then you're not exempt and you probably need an IND. Additionally, a study must meet all of these criteria. So as I mentioned, it's not for a new indication, and the use that you're studying this would not require a significant labeling change to cover it. You're not going to be trying to get a change in advertising at some point. This does not involve a route of administration, dosing level, or patient population that significantly increases the risk. This goes back to that example I mentioned at the very beginning about the antacids. So in that situation, over-the-counter product, very safe. I don't even know if you could count that as a use because they were just doing a taste study to see which of these antacids taste better. But the fact that individuals could potentially be exposed to really high levels of dosing that's way beyond the labeling, it was cause for concern, and that was why we required an IND. Another great example is children or other vulnerable populations, geriatrics, for example. So a drug may be approved and may even have labeling that covers down to ages 12 or something in pediatric, or way up into all ages of geriatrics. But we all know that those populations have different considerations that are very important. They can have certain hepatic impairments or renal impairments, and so the doses that may be in the labeling may not be safe for that particular study, that population that you're planning to conduct. So in that situation, we would also require an IND. And then you have to, of course, comply with the requirements for having an IRB and having informed consent. So all those patient protections, or human subject protections. So that, even if you're exempt, you should be doing this anyways. Your institution where you're doing research is probably going to require you to go through your IRB anyways. And then conducted in compliance with CFR 312.7, which is all about promotion and charging. That says if this is really a study and it's not an approved use, you really shouldn't be charging for it. And you should definitely not be promoting this as something that actually works. You can charge for it, but there are certain requirements. That's a subject maybe of a different presentation. And then there's some very specific examples of where you can be exempt. So in vitro biologic diagnostic products, blood grouping serums, reagent blood cells, anti-human globulin. And there's there's much more detail in the regulations if you actually go to the exemption regulations about what actually these products are. In vitro or laboratory research animals, the FDA doesn't require INDs for those. Those actually follow different pathways that go through the NIH if you're interested. Certain bioavailability studies can actually be done without an IND. So if you're in the business of making generic drugs, or maybe making 505(b)(2) drugs, which are similar, just sort of reformulations of approved drugs, usually you do a lot of bioavailability studies, and not all the time do you actually require an IND to do those. And then radioactive drugs for certain research uses do not require INDs as well. So if you think you fall into one of those categories, I'd encourage you to go to the regulations and actually read the specific definition of those products and things you might also consider. All right, so we worked through this. Yes, it's a drug. Yes, it's being used in a clinical investigation. And no, it's not exempt based on those previous 2 slides. So you need an IND. Well, now what? We'll talk about that. First, I want to give you a little bit of an intro to the types or categories of INDs. So there's 2 categories, and really CDER sort of considered these or created these 2 categories for its own internal review sort of management practices. These aren't defined in the regulations or in the statutes anywhere. So there's commercial INDs. So these are INDs for which a sponsor is either corporate entity, so pharmaceutical company, biopharmaceutical company, or one of the institutes of the National Institute of Health. Don't ask me how that came to be, that policy over a very long period of time for CDER. Research, which would simply be non-commercial. So these are your research investigators or physicians that are doing small studies. So essentially it's anyone who's not one of those commercial entities falls into the category of researchers. And to give you some statistics, about 51% of our INDs over the last 3 years were research INDs, so non-commercial. So the companies aren't doing all of the INDs. And then also, if I can just make a little push for those researchers out there who are doing INDs, definitely come and talk to your review divisions early, because we spend a lot of time, probably a dramatic amount of time, with our research IND holders because they need more guidance and more help. They don't have the big pharmaceutical industry company regulatory affairs department behind them to help them. And we're definitely there to help. But just talk to us early, because the earlier you talk to us, the easier it can be. Types of INDs. There's essentially, again, 2 types of INDs. There's the more traditional IND, which is for clinical investigations. And the situation there is essentially you are conducting an investigation. And we talked about what an investigation is. Remember, it's an experiment. And the investigational drug is only going to be administered or dispensed within the context of that experiment or that investigation. The other type is actually for treatment. And this is where I was going a little bit earlier. I mentioned about some of the history of the regulations that led up to the compassionate use or expanded access INDs. And there's a talk, I believe it's later today, that's going to go in much more detail about expanded access INDs. These are essentially those instances where we're using an investigational drug outside of a clinical trial for use of treating a patient with a serious or life-threatening condition, and they have no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy. So a little bit more on the expanded access, just a little bit, because you're going to get a big presentation on this. You have 3 types of those. So the individual, so single patient INDs, and we try to make that very simple, particularly if it's an emergency. You can just call into the review division and ask for authorization for that. Then there's intermediate size patient population INDs, where you have more than one, but less than several hundred. And the situation also can be very early in development. You don't quite know exactly where the efficacy is for this product, but you do know that's safe, and there has been some of that phase 1 studies, some of those phase 1 studies conducted. And then you have treatment. These are much broader. These are really the types of INDs that bridge the gap between your phase 3 studies or your confirmatory studies and market approval. So we all know it takes the FDA a while to review the marketing application. So your phase 3 study might have concluded. There's a lot of patients that still want to have access to this product, so you might use a treatment IND or a treatment protocol under your existing IND to cover that. All right, so now we'll talk about jurisdiction. This is, again, a little bit of CDER policy or Office of New Drugs policy. So you won't find this in regulations, or you won't find this in the statute. So we essentially assign each IND to a particular review division, and there's about 19 review divisions. 15 or 16 of them very hands-on directly interact with you guys. The other couple do pediatric and maternal health, or they do non-prescription drugs, and I'll go through a list of those in a second. Those review divisions' portfolios are defined by their primary endpoint. So I came from the Division of Gastroenterology and Inborn Errors of Metabolism, but we'll set inborn errors aside for a second because they're unique. But within gastroenterology, most of the primary endpoints, depending on the disease, they might be, reflux, or they might be bowel movements. And so based on those primary endpoints, any study looking at those primary endpoints would go to that division because they were gastroenterological endpoints. If jurisdiction is not obvious based on the primary endpoints, they're really not looking at clinical outcome assessments on efficacy or effectiveness. They're kind of looking at safety measures. Then safety would be the trump factor. So that's where we would had a hard time saying that word now, but that's where you would consider where safety is important. So are there unique issues related to safety that would require you to review this in the gastroenterology division or the oncology division? So if this was a drug that was supposed to reduce diarrhea, but it was being used in patients who were undergoing chemotherapy for tier 2 pancreatic cancer, then that drug, depending on where the biggest safety concern would be, which might be associated to the chemo, it would probably go to the oncology division. Confusing, but if anything you take away from this, definitely talk to the review division when you are on the fence about jurisdiction. Precedent is also a really big factor in determining jurisdiction. So if that oncology division has just simply reviewed all of the antidiarrheals for chemotherapy-induced diarrhea, just to use that example, I don't even know if that's a true indication, then that division would continue to review those INDs. And you guys won't know what those precedents are, so again, encourage you to reach out to the review divisions. As I mentioned, they're responsible for handling jurisdiction issues and managing the IND assignments. So once you know you need an IND, the first step really needs to be contact the review division that you think is most likely going to be reviewing your application. The next few slides have all the contact information for all of the review divisions. I'm not going to go through these. You'll have the slides, I believe. All right. The next issue I want to cover or topic is bundling. So is one or more IND needed? Because we would get this question a lot when we would have these REdI conferences, and I thought it was important to go over it a little bit. So bundling is possible, and what I mean by bundling, it means you have multiple indications within that same IND application. So I think I'm going to do a study that's going to impact headaches and nausea and vomiting at the same time. You might be able to put that together or bundle it with your initial IND in certain situations. So if you're not entirely sure at that point what your indication or what the dosage would be, and it's very early, so you're just looking at a phase 1, and all you're looking at is the toxicity and the safety of the product. You're not even sure where you're going to actually end up in phase 2 or phase 3 at this point. You can probably bundle. One indication, but they're very related indications. So nausea and vomiting, very related indications. Maybe if they're not associated with an oncologic product or indication, then maybe both of those would belong in the division of gastroenterology, even though they're two separate indications. They have separate primary endpoints, etc. Or multiple closely related routes of administration using the same dosage formulation. So again, it's very early. You're just starting to understand your product. You're reformulating, and you have capsules and you have tablets, or maybe you have intravenous and you have subcutaneous. You can probably bundle those two routes of administration within the same IND. Combination of 2 or more investigational new drugs for concomitant use. So if you're co-developing a product for co-marketing, this is a situation where it's also okay to bundle within the IND. Conversely, it may be appropriate for the sponsor to submit more than one IND if one of these holds true. So if you're developing the product in 2 or more unrelated conditions, so that's just the opposite of what I just said in the previous slide, or you've got multiple dosage forms and they're being extensively investigated, because that might require us on our end to have different review teams reviewing those different formulations, because there's just so much work that's being done by you. Same with multiple routes of administration. So again, now what? You've determined your clinical investigation requires an IND. It was a drug. You know where you think you know which division to talk to, right? Because you sort of worked through those earlier slides, and you've got all the phone numbers now. And you know it needs to be one or multiple INDs, so you've figured out the bundling issue. What next? So we have the PreIND Consultation program. And I mentioned earlier, I was kind of focusing on the research INDs and the research IND holders, but really everyone, including the commercial IND holders, come and talk to us as early as possible. Right after this presentation, you'll hear from Rachel Klein, and she's going to talk about all these amazing communication pathways that you have to access us. We're very transparent. So PreIND Consultation program, what we essentially mean is pre-IND meetings. So before you have an IND open, before you've had FDA say, yes, go ahead and do your study, you've got an IND, you can come and talk to us, and you can open up what's known as a pre-IND. So it's just like having an IND application with us, but it's pre-IND, and we'll keep track of all of our communications. You can come in and talk to us about issues related to data needed to support the rationale for testing the drug in humans. You can talk to us about the non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology information or the drug's activity, any unique design issues or treatment issues before you, that you've learned from the animal studies that you need to understand before you move into humans, what the data requirements might be. So if you've gone through the regulations, you've looked at guidances that we have available, and there's, I was telling Ray, it's really nice they have all the guidances back there on the back wall outside of this room, but that's like the tip of the iceberg. So, you can go through a lot of guidances and your head will start spinning, but it will give you a good start. But then come in and talk to us because we can help you sort of walk through that and give you a little bit more of a hands-on approach to what is needed for your IND. The only hesitation or remark I'd say there is that we are still the FDA, so we may ask for almost everything that we would want to see in an IND. You have to sort of leverage that about where you want to go with that particular first study and how much is needed at that time. Initial drug development plans. Really, I teach a course at George Washington University about drug development planning, how you go and you create the drug development plan. And FDA is not considered a partner or a key opinion leader when you're developing the drug development plan, but we can be. If you want to reach out to us at your pre-IND meeting and say, here's sort of our outline of our drug development plan, types of studies we want to do and the timing for some of these things, we will absolutely comment on that. So feel free to use us for drug development planning as well. And of course, regulatory requirements and what would eventually be needed to demonstrate safety and efficacy. And while the typical phased approach we all have heard, phase 1, 2, and 3, we also know that drugs don't always develop that way. A lot of them, they're maybe repurposed or they're coming from different markets. And so you could come in ready to do a phase 3 study and you're absolutely ready to talk about what do I need to prove to get this labeling claim. So a pre-IND meeting can also be held when you're at a much later stage in drug development. As I mentioned, FDA encourages you guys to use the pre-IND meeting. There's a couple of areas where we particularly encourage it. So if the drug's never been approved, never been licensed for a biologic, meaning it's probably a new molecular entity. If you're planning a 505(b)(2) application, so I don't know if we have a talk about that, but essentially a 505(b)(2) is where you've taken an approved product and you're adjusting or you're reformulating that product in such a way that it requires a new application, and it's not a 505J or a generic, so the ANDA. You should come and talk to us because those are pretty complicated. There's a lot of legal issues and regulatory issues that you would want to discuss with the FDA. Drugs for which it's critical to public health, and an effective and an efficient drug development plan is really important. So counterterrorism, or think about the Ebola. We really want to talk to companies if you're developing a product for something that's really important to public health because we want to help. Drugs with substantial early development outside the United States. So if you're planning to try and come and get marketing approval in the US, it's really important you come and talk to us before you try to do that study to sort of bridge the gap to the work that's been done previously, because there's some unique issues to work through. A planned human factors development program. So these are very unique studies, understanding how the drug is going to be used in practice, where that use is very critical to the safety and effectiveness of the product. And so there's very certain criteria that we have to follow for those types of studies, so we encourage you to speak with us. And drugs with adequate, well-controlled studies to support any new indications, we also would like to speak with you. In bold down here at the bottom is you can always request a pre-IND meeting with us for anything. We'll have a talk, I believe also, I think it's probably in Rachel's talk, about the process for how these meetings are granted and what goes into our considerations. But I think if we present the numbers, we would be an overwhelming number are granted. So they may not get granted with an actual meeting. You might get teleconference with the FDA review division, or you might get written responses only, but you'll most likely hear back from us and you'll get help with your requests. So do reach out. So in summary, or in for your takeaways, the IND essentially notifies the FDA that you're going to be doing a clinical investigation with something that's a drug. It sort of also gives you permission or meets the legal obligations to be exempt from the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. It's required for many clinical investigations. There are some exceptions. They're usually pretty rare because FDA does take a relatively conservative approach, but probably your IRB at your institution or wherever you're working probably takes as conservative an approach too. And there's lots of nuance. So I couldn't possibly give you a talk today that you could walk away from and you would know all the time. Even when I was a chief, and I think there's a couple of other chiefs of project management in the room, and we handled most of the jurisdiction issues and the questions about when an IND is needed, I rarely knew the answer right off the bat. You have to really get to know. Sometimes we just had to request the protocol and look at it. So you might as well submit the IND anyways, and then we'll tell you it's exempt, because you need almost sometimes that level of detail to really know. And we highly encourage sponsors to utilize the PreIND Consultation program. Come and talk to us. That's it, and we'll do questions. And we have 10 minutes for questions. Perfect.
Great. For those of you who have been here before and remember how this is played, please step up to the microphone in the room. For those of you online, during the session, we were encouraging you to enter your questions online. Do we have any online questions? While all of you are considering your questions and lining up back here, let's go ahead and start with our first online question, please.
The first online question, how do you define exploratory INDs?
Okay, so the question was, how do you define exploratory INDs? So I don't have the definition memorized, and I'm sure there is a very discrete definition of it, but I'll give you maybe my paraphrase or my understanding of the concept of an exploratory IND. So an exploratory IND is you're just looking to understand more about that molecule or that product. And so you might be looking at its on-target effects, you might be looking at maybe its off-target effects and understanding its safety a little bit. You probably don't know exactly what indication you're going to be studying quite yet. And so that's sort of what an exploratory IND is. There's a whole guidance on exploratory INDs, and so for that individual, I encourage them to go into the guidances section of the FDA website and just type in exploratory IND, and you'll pull up the most current guidance.
Okay, now are people in the room just shy or don't want to have to fight your way out to the microphone? Because if that's the case, I can hand the microphone down to you if you want to pose a question for Kevin. In the meantime, let's go ahead and take our next online question, please.
The next online question, where do you actually go for the pre-IND meeting?
So if it's going to be in person, I'm assuming this is where to actually go physically to have the face-to-face meeting, right? So where you would go in person is over in Silver Spring. So there's the White Oak campus. Most people, when they think of Silver Spring, they think of the downtown area. So the White Oak campus is North New Hampshire of the downtown area, so above the Beltway. Office of New Drugs primarily meets in Building 22. And so you'll come to campus, you'll go to the main entrance, you'll check in through security, and then you'll be escorted to your meeting. It's a nice campus. It's fun. I think so. But you can also have those via teleconference.
Okay, we've got our first question in the room. Please, go ahead.
Hi, Chris Asiela from the NHLBI. I work with a lot of both small businesses and academic PIs who are developing new therapies. And one of the concerns that they often express is, well, if I go to the FDA early, they're going to give me a whole lot of work, and I'm not going to be able to afford to do it. The second thing that they say to me is, I can only get one pre-IND meeting. And I try to encourage them that having a dialogue early doesn't necessarily bind them into a development path. It's a dialogue. And that they can actually interact, at least with the review team, if not in a formal meeting more than once. Could you expand a little bit on how that works so that we can make the room,
Sure.
the expanded room a little more?
No, well, I think you answered the first question very, very well. And yes, we have heard the concern that, oh, I'll only get one pre-IND meeting, but there's nothing that in the regulations that limits the pre-IND meeting or pre-IND consultation to just one. The way to think about it is if you actually have a pre-IND meeting, you're given some advice, you go off and you do some work on that advice, maybe you had to do another study or you needed to do some more literature review, you come back with new information, new questions, most likely you'll be able to have another pre-IND meeting. Now that's not a guarantee because review divisions are also very busy, so sometimes they may only be able to respond in written response only. They won't be able to have an actual meeting with you because they need to prioritize other fresh or naive pre-IND meetings. But there's absolutely no sort of limitation there, so I absolutely always encourage you to reach out and request your second, your third, fourth. I'm not going to go beyond that, but just request because it doesn't hurt to request the meeting. Even if you're denied, you can always, probably get some responses back to your questions in written form. And then for the second part of the question, if I remember correctly, remind me, the second part of the question? Okay. Okay, all right. And I think Rachel's going to also get into this a little bit later, so she'll talk more about that. Oh, and I remember. So you asked about, well, FDA is going to tell me to do 20, 30 different things, and I'm not prepared to do all of that. I think they're always going to be very conservative, and I kind of give you the ideal sort of what needs to be done, and you have to balance that with where your program needs to go and what's needed at that time. And so, and FDA is very scientific, and they're willing to discuss. They're not going to just, here's what you have to do, and then walk away. So they're willing to have a conversation about that.
Okay, and I since we're in a smaller room, I am in full Phil Donahue mode right now. Did I just age myself? So I see another hand over here, but our first question's over here, please.
Thank you. Tom Baracchione, Zymedica. Our company does a lot of human factors and usability evaluations for drug delivery devices. And I'm anxious to hear a little more about how an ongoing human factors development program impacts an ongoing IND.
So that's a great question. So he's asking, how does the human factor studies that are ongoing affect the IND? So usually if you're doing human factor study for some sort of drug delivery device, it's an auto-injector or pre-filled syringe of some sort, the way it impacts the drug is because unless you're just trying to get that auto-injector approved for a very broad use, which is where you would be dealing with the CDRH, most of the time when you're working with the FDA CDER, you're going to be trying to get it approved for that one use of that one drug. And so it becomes almost a combination product. It probably is a combination product. And so if that product is going to be approved and marketed, then you're going to have to also have the human factors or usability studies completed at the same time. And that marketing application is coming through for review. I think that varies depending on the review division, the product, type of co-packaged device that you might have.
Okay, and while I get over to our next question, let's take one more from online, please.
Can I submit an NDA without having an open IND?
So the question was, can I submit an NDA without having an open IND? So the answer is yes. But clearly, if you had to do any studies in the US with humans, then you probably needed to have an IND open. So, but there are situations where you can do that. It's probably a good idea, though, to have a meeting with the FDA before you submit the NDA. And so you could have that as your pre-IND meeting under some sort of pre-IND. I think there's also, we're very flexible. We won't make you sort of open a pre-IND. We can also open a pre-NDA or a pre-submission application there to hold the meeting, but definitely would encourage you to meet with the FDA before you submit the marketing application.
Next question in the room.
Hi, Hassan Naqvi from Johns Hopkins University. My question is around the IND categories. Can we start in one IND category and change it over to another? So start with an investigator-initiated trial. Turns out that company is interested, or we want to do a spin-off or something like that. Could we change that to a commercial IND and go from there? Thank you.
So the question is, if my study starts out under a research IND, can it be changed over to commercial IND? So remember what I said, that the types of INDs is really, or the categories of INDs is really something that CDER does as a policy to sort of help us manage the INDs. So you don't really have to worry about what we're calling it. We're going to give you just as much service as we can regardless. But there is a process for how INDs are transferred from, say, a PI to a commercial entity. So there's some regulations that will help you navigate that process. We can talk after if you're interested.
Next online question, please.
If you believe that you meet the requirements of an exemption, do you need FDA approval to proceed with the investigation?
Great question. So someone is asking, if you believe you meet all of the exemption criteria, do you need FDA approval before proceeding with your investigation? So the answer is actually no, but remember, there's also IRBs that are going to be reviewing your studies. And so sometimes, and we've heard this quite a bit, and the NIH centers and groups will also ask for this, is they want something from the FDA that does say that they're exempt. So you can reach out to the FDA in that case and get an exemption letter from us that says that the study is exempt from the requirements.
Okay, again, if there's any questions in the room, raise your hand, I'll come to you. Also, I failed to mention, since this is the first time that we're on one of our QA slides with our on-screen survey, especially for those of you who are attending online, you can just click on that link and give us some feedback on this individual session. For those of you in the room, if you want to give some feedback, you can type that link in your browser. Next online question, please.
What is the difference between a Type C meeting and a formal pre-IND meeting?
So I'm actually going to table that for the next talk because I think you'll get the answer to that. Rachel will do a much better
No pressure, Rachel. Okay, we got 45 seconds left. Do I have one more online question we can go to?
Why are certain drugs exempt from an IND?
Well, there's a whole couple of slides on that and the regulatory piece about that because the FDA is really there to protect human subjects from being exposed to products that don't have any information about their safety, or if it's a study about the level of dosing that's being used, there's no information about that. So the FDA is not there to impose itself on all of research. It's there to really just protect subjects. Good question.
Okay, and with that, that is all the time we have for Kevin. Help me thank Kevin for coming out and speaking with us today.